Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 16th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that is because of the support of individuals just like you. Those of you who are interested in pledging your support, it's on an episodic basis. You can do it by visiting patreon.com/talknerdy. My top patrons this week include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Dudas Infinitas, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right, let's talk about this week's episode. It's a good one, you guys. It's always a good one, but this is a good one. Yeah. I had the opportunity to sit down once again with Emily Willingham. And if you remember, Emily Willingham was on the show several years ago when we were talking about her new book at the time, Fallacy: Life Lessons from the Animal Penis. She's an awesome and just like so talented and well-respected science journalist. She writes for, a bunch of different outlets, but she's a regular contributor to Scientific American. You can find a lot of her work there. And she has a new book. This book is a different book. We're talking about a totally different topic this week, which is really exciting, and one that's near and dear to my heart. The book is called The Tailored Brain: From Ketamine to Keto to Companionship, a user's guide to feeling better and thinking smarter. So yeah, we're going to talk about all things the brain, all things what you can do and what you can't do, sort of really understanding some of the myths, some of the, being skeptical with a lot of the sort of self-help stuff that's out there, but also having an open mind to see what works, what doesn't, and, how we can really work on ourselves. So, without any further ado, the author of The Tailored Brain, here she is, Emily Willingham. Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here again.
Yay, yeah, second time. So the last time we had you on the show to talk about your book, Fallacy: Life Lessons from the Animal Penis, and your new book is it's a very different topic, but still within the, I think, the kind of skeptical, critical thinking, exciting world of science communication. So I have to ask you right here at the very top. So the book is called The Tailored Brain, but the subtitle, I don't know if it's just me, but I feel I'm like sensing some irony in how it's written. Is that just me?
You might be sensing a little bit of workshopping as well, but yeah. There is some in there, right? Because a couple of those things maybe are not, well, one of them especially maybe not quite so evidence-based as the other two.
Right. So The Tailored Brain: From Ketamine to Keto to Companionship, a user's guide to feeling better and thinking smarter. I guess, and for me, like, okay, sure, the keto thing is like red flaggy, but what I love is that your writing is so debunky, it's so evidence-based, it's so critical thinking and like skeptical in its approach, like very classic and respectful science communication. And what's funny to me is that the subtitle of the book feels a little like a self-help book.
It does, doesn't it? And
yes.
So I think it's kind of interesting because I think I have a friend who's written a book that's kind of like this. It's in the exercise realm. It's Christy Ashwanden. And
I had her on the show. Yeah.
So she wrote Good to Go. And she, and it's basically the entire thing is debunking all these claims about what will help you, like in recovery, athletics recovery and that kind of thing. And people just got mad at her because it wasn't, because I think they were kind of looking for something self-helpy, and then it doesn't turn out to be that way because the science just doesn't go that way. And so there's that definitely more than a soupçon of that in this title. And, I'm hoping like in the first, 2-3 chapters that kind of gets smoothed out a little bit when, people engage with the material.
Yeah. In a way, it's kind of like, obviously, clearly it's not a bait and switch, because if you even just read the description of the book, you know exactly what it's about, like
Yeah,
right there in the front cover. But in a way, there is sort of this, I don't know, hope that maybe it'll get into the hands of the people who are a little more credulous, or who are sort of hoping for the quick fix. Because the idea here is that there really is no quick fix when it comes to cognitive health, when it comes to brain health. There are a lot of offerings, but not a lot of them are evidence-based.
Yeah, so many offerings, so little evidence is true.
Yes. So I'm excited to be talking to you about this topic. My background, of course, is in clinical psychology and neuroscience. I'm finishing my PhD. I say finishing. I still have a whole year left, but I'm about to start internship for my clinical psych PhD. I'm, finishing my dissertation now, and I've moved more into the therapy realm. But when I first started years and years and years ago, actually as an undergrad, and then sort of moving through my master's, I always thought I was going to be a neuropsychologist. I very quickly realized that I don't love assessment, and that's a huge part of what neuropsychologists do. They don't do a lot of therapy. They mostly do a lot of evaluations. And I was like, oh, this is not really fun for me. So I switched gears and moved more into a deeper therapy space. But this is a world that is near and dear to my heart. So I'm super excited to dive into it with you today.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that.
Awesome.
It should be fun.
Yes. Okay, so I want to start with, where do I want to start? Like, maybe we talk a little bit about what neuropsychology is, what psychology is, and then maybe we can get more into sort of what's on offer and what is evidence-based. And I guess even before we do all that, you are a science journalist. You're like one of the premier science communicators in a group of people that I really, really respect. And I, whenever you're publishing pieces online, I'm going to link to your pieces on my social media. And so I'm interested how you choose the topics that you go into, because they are kind of like wide reaching.
They really are. And it was very hard to narrow them down. So one of the first things I had to do was just to kind of sweep away, with just a couple of exceptions, anything that was prescription, because this is kind of more of a what can you reach for yourself sort of book. And tons and tons of books have been written on, prescription antidepressants and things like that. So that was one thing. The other thing is what seemed, and the rest of it's very subjective, but I did have sort of a mental metric for it, and it's what might attract people the most, what seems to be kind of hot right now, and then what has a recent evidence base that I could examine, or in some cases none at all, but they were just so popular it warranted an examination. And so those were kind of my parameters for what to choose. But there's just so much. I mean, there could be several other books probably on the things I left out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you could write a whole book just about that new Alzheimer's drug and
Right.
how fraught it is.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, it's how do we define like what's popular? Like, were you sort of looking at what's the clickbait on Instagram? What's in the self-help or psychology section when you're sort of like wandering around a bookstore? Like, how did you even know what is being targeted or marketed towards people to improve their cognition or to reduce their sort of negative brain symptoms?
That's a good question. And I think mostly it's what I registered just out there. So I did do some systematic searches, obviously, but, and so you can find, first of all, it's no surprise, psychedelics are everywhere, right? And it's not
everywhere.
And it's not just out there in the popular, things for popular consumption, but also a couple of corners of, neuroscience research people have really built out working on that. And so I knew that was something I needed to address. And then things like there were like subreddits devoted to, do it yourself brain zapping things and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's the popularity of the brain games and the claims that people make about them. And all of that is still very much out there on, the radar for people and turning up over and over again in, the quote unquote wellness spaces and in health stories and things like that.
So there's sort of different kind of ways that like taxonomically we could categorize this stuff. And I'm sure there's like a million different options that you grappled with for like how to slice and dice this. There's topics, there's approaches, and of course there's sort of, I'm always interested when I'm thinking about pseudoscience or pseudopsychology, I'm always interested in the difference between the things that are like mostly evidence-based but can be misused, the things that are sort of like on the fence, like we're still deep in the research, kind of like when I think about psychedelics, like there's some interesting outcome studies, and it's also just been taken to the nth degree. It's kind of like marijuana. It's like there's some people you talk to who think it's such a panacea, like it will cure every ailment, and then it's like no, but there are a couple things it could be good for, and then there's the stuff where it's just straight up bunk, just straight up pseudoscience. It doesn't do anything, and
Right.
so I'm curious. Obviously you dabbled in all of these different areas, but where were you finding sort of you were spending the most time or you were the most interested in, and how did you make sense of just all the claims that are out there?
I found myself spending the most time in, the psychedelic territory would
Okay.
definitely be one. And
Yeah.
I also, in the end, and this was just completely accidental, I found myself spending a ton of time with physical activity and social interaction, and really, really surprising to me, mindfulness, because it's just not something that I naturally gravitate toward, and I had to go dig into all of that literature because of the claims that are made around it. And then there is a substantial literature on it, which, I was kind of taken with that. It was very helpful during a pandemic to make that kind of a discovery. And the bottom line is, everybody says the gold standard is a randomized controlled trial. Those are few and far between for a lot of things. And so it's, hard to say for most of these things that this is fundamentally a yes, right? But there are certainly things that have a lot stronger base than others.
Yeah, it's something I've been grappling with a lot. And I mean, I might be making a tiny left turn here, but for those of you listening, bear with me. It's sort of hard to start making categorical claims about debunking or about saying, yes, this is evidence based until you really understand what it means for something to be evidence based. And so, sort of understanding, like you said, what is the gold standard in research? How do we determine whether or not something is legitimate? And so, coming from the psych side, when I used to come from the neuroscience side, I moved from this very almost logical positivist medical model view where, like you said, the randomized controlled trial is key, into a world where I started to understand a little bit better that when it comes to psychological studies, it's hard to treat them always like drug trials because therapeutics aren't drugs. And so how do you blind certain things? Can you really trust that that placebo group is actually unaware that they're getting the placebo? Like things start to get a lot more complicated. And so I think the definition of evidence-based, or maybe we should say evidence-informed, it becomes a little bit wigglier. And also when it comes to therapy, for example, it is more tailored. It has to be. Like the way I do therapy with one of my patients can't be applied to a different patient. There are certain standards, like in CBT, that we utilize, but I also take an existential approach, which is like exactly what the title of your book is. It is the tailored brain. It's about saying, I'm going to help you with your specific complaints from a very kind of constructivist perspective. And how could I ever do a clinical trial or, a really classic randomized controlled trial on that?
Right. And so, and you're right. And to point this out, because if, first of all, they have tried this kind of fun placebo question to deal with is like, how do you do a placebo with a psychedelics trial? And one of the things that they tried to do in some trials is give people niacin, because if you give them enough of that, you get this tingly and this flush, and it can be and they don't, that they don't know they're getting niacin. So they have a feeling of something. And so that's supposed to kind of efface the potential for a placebo effect in that situation. But, in terms of evidence informed work, then if you can't do randomized controlled trials on a lot of things for lots of reasons, like the ones you just said, and sometimes for ethical reasons and so forth. And so the next best thing you can do, right, is to get a lot of trials that are kind of similar in design, like observational studies with a similar design, and pool all of that and meta-analyze those data and see what emerges from that. And it's not, going to be a ground truth or anything, but it can certainly serve as a guide. And there's a lot of that in the things that I looked at. There are lots of meta analyses to try to pull this together. The big problem, though, as you probably know, is that nobody ever does the same design, and nobody ever quite does things in exactly the same way. And a lot of these studies have very tiny numbers of people in them, which, again, makes the meta analysis a little bit, it gives it a little more power to say whether or not you've got something or not.
Right. Like, we're never going to be completely sure. It's kind of like it's hard to prove a positive. Like, we're never going to be completely sure that something works and that it works exactly this way and that it works all the time. But there are definitely meta analyses out there that help us understand what doesn't work. Like when you start to look at a bunch of different trials, and we see this a lot with homeopathy or traditional Chinese medicine, or, these like kind of classic approaches to pseudoscience in medicine and psychology. And you start to see that, okay, this is a coin flip. Like sometimes they're having positive outcomes, sometimes they're not. If I just change this one variable, all of a sudden, or change the power of the study, all of a sudden it's garbage. That can be really, really, really telling.
It can be. And the other thing is that on the flip side of that coin, maybe, I'm not sure, that probably doesn't work as a metaphor. But when you look at something like antidepressants, right, when you come down to it, with the placebo effect, it is almost a coin flip when you look at how, the efficacy of those drugs. But that doesn't mean that they actually don't work. I think that sometimes what looks like a coin flip is a binary distribution. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's got, you get two humps there where there's a group of people for whom it's just not really doing much, but then there's a group of people for whom it is. And so it is definitely like where you're standing as you look at the data is going to make a difference as well.
You're absolutely right. And I think about that a lot when I think about my approach to therapy with patients. Like, we know that very often, almost across every diagnostic category, there are certain CBT models that are the gold standard. My argument often is the reason that they're the gold standard is because they're the easiest to study. Like, they're the most manualized, they're the easiest to
Right.
lend themselves to an RCT. But even looking beyond that, like, I'll have patients who I'm like, I can't use this model with this patient, even though I know that this is, probably the most evidence-based way to approach it, because this patient doesn't have the buy-in. They're not going to do the homework. They're not interested in, taking this approach. And the only way that I'm going to be able to reach them is through a kind of backdoor roundabout type of psychotherapy. And so when I think about antidepressants, it's the same way. Like, I take Prozac every day, and good God, does it work for me? And my father takes Prozac every day, and I know it works for him. And I have a feeling there's some sort of hereditary situation, because I've tried different antidepressants that had very not great outcomes. But then you meet other people who are like, I took that drug and it made me hear voices, or it made me suicidal, or I literally didn't feel anything.
Right.
It
Yeah.
didn't do anything. And the thing is, this is very crude medicine. We're taking something that blocks reuptake of serotonin, but we have no way to test whether our serotonin levels are normal.
Right. We're a long way from precision medicine. That's another reason I
Yeah.
didn't, want to get, I think, because the people write entire books about those things, right? And I didn't really want to go there with that. But the way you describe, the choice about CBT, and is this somebody for whom this is going to be, that they're going to relate to it and be able to do it. And that's where I think the tailoring comes in. But in the book, I'm not a therapist by any stretch. And so I'm more asking people to interrogate, well, why do I want to fix this? Am I telling myself that this is a problem for me, or somebody else telling me that? And if I do decide to do it, what options are going to work best for me at what quote unquote doses of those options? And I think people can, in that sense, kind of do precision medicine, or not medicine, this isn't really medicine, but precision, self-help on their own that way.
Yeah, I think that's great. And so why don't we talk about some of the topics that are in the book? Because as we mentioned, this is very tailored, and some things work for some people, and it really, a lot of it's based on their biochemistry, a lot of it's based on their personality, a lot of it's based on the amount of social support that they have. And truth be told, it's kind of a guessing game. When you're working with a professional, you may have a little more how do I word this? Almost like more collaboration in your ability to guess. a little bit more
Right.
educated guessing, but there's
Yeah.
still a lot of guessing that goes into it. And so, let's look at just your subtitle, ketamine to keto to companionship. I want to start with keto. We'll come back to psychedelics, but tell me a little bit about not just keto, but about diets and the industry of sort of like eat right for your brain health. And the more that you eat a certain way, the cognitive clarity and the supplement industry. And gosh, there's just so much to unpack there.
Yeah, so the problem with keto, like the out of the gate, is nobody defines it the same way. Nobody describe, it's not the same diet. Everybody calls it that, but it's hugely variable. There's an enormous amount of variability in what is called a ketogenic diet. But there is actually a clinical version of the ketogenic diet that you would have to work with nutritionists to develop, and it has been used for a pretty long time for people who have epilepsy, and it has helped to there's I don't think a ton of question about this. It does reduce their seizures to have this diet, but it's a very carefully controlled kind of low carb, high fat diet, and it goes back like thousands of years. I think there's some mention in some ancient Greek literature of the people who eat less of this tend to have fewer seizures. So that's something that's been around for a long time. But to extrapolate that and say, well, maybe one of the things that happens is on a keto diet, you have less of the neurotransmitter glutamate. I know you know what that is, but right. And that's the excitatory neurotransmitter. And so seizures are kind of in broad terms, kind of overexcitement and in the brain, a storm of it really. And the keto diet, they think this very specific medicalized version of it reduces this amount of glutamate that's available to the brain. It's depleted in this diet. And it's possible to say, well, or you can hypothesize, well, in that case, for other things that are kind of adjacent, right? Maybe adjacent to too much of a role of glutamate, like anxiety or something. Maybe it might have some efficacy for that. But the thing is, again, there's just so much variability in keto and in what people call it that it's hard to really say that that's the case. They're just kind of hints of a possibility here.
And sadly,
and then the final thing about this diet is it's really hard to stick to a keto diet. If I don't know if you've ever tried it, I'd read something that might help with cardiovascular lipid profiles at some point, and which I kind of need some help with. And so I sort of tried to start one. I don't even eat that much in the way of carbs in the first place, and it was still pretty hard. Your brain needs glucose, right? It wants that to function. So there are lots of it's a mixed bag with that for sure.
Yeah, and the funny thing is I feel like half the time when people are like touting the benefits of keto, it's just to lose weight. Like it doesn't even seem to have anything to do with excitotoxicity or any sort of like problem with too much of these like upper kind of neurotransmitters, which, you think about it, it could have really detrimental effects. What if that's not your profile and you're misusing this? I mean, A, we don't even know if it actually does that in kind of a healthy brain, but B, what if that's not your profile? What if you struggle with depression and anhedonia or dysthymia and almost like not enough glutamine, and then you are starting to depress it even further, and then there are some like actual dangers of going into ketosis when you really start to change the amount of glucose that you're eating, right?
Yeah, I mean, nothing, as we know, is without risk, and certainly nothing that has effects on things like your mood is going to be without risk if this does indeed affect mood. So, yeah. And then there are like physiological risks, I think, maybe I'm thinking kidneys and stuff like that. So it's, there are lots of drawbacks to it, but some people have found great success with it for whatever their goals are. So I'm not going to say drop your keto diet, but it's too heterogeneous to say. I mean, the way people characterize these diets, to say that this is doing anything that you can directly associate with it.
Yeah, and I see this a lot. I mean, take keto and expand it to supplementation, expand it to vitamin drips, expand it to like I have been taking. So this is a very personal, like, kind of thing that I will say out loud, but I've been struggling with fatigue and daytime sleepiness, and I'm working with like a neurologist and doing a sleep study, but I've also been working with hematology because my iron is abysmal no matter how much I supplement, and my B12 is really struggling. Like my numbers are really, really low, so I have to take weekly injections of B12.
Are you a
And
vegetarian?
no, that's the crazy thing. I eat meat. So we're like, what is going on? And I actually have to go in next week for an iron infusion because my oral supplementation hasn't been working. But of course, I'm working with experts I'm working with licensed, credentialed, board certified physicians in specialties. But I have friends, because I live in LA, who are like, oh, I love B12. Whenever I get a B12 shot, I just feel amazing. And I'm like, first of all, why are you getting a B12 shot? And second of all, what are you even talking about? I don't feel it at all. And when I talk to my physicians about that, I'm like, I didn't feel anything when I started supplementing with B12. They were like, yeah, it's a placebo. Whenever people say that they feel awesome when they get these vitamin drips, it's because they want to feel awesome. Like, it doesn't have that instant effect. It doesn't work that way. And plus, if you have a normal amount of this vitamin, taking more is not beneficial. Actually, sometimes it can be really, really dangerous. And it worries me when I see people supplementing with like 4,000% of the daily recommended dosage when their blood work shows that they already have enough.
Yeah, when at first I was going to look at a lot of different supplements in this book, and then in the end, after I did a review of the literature of a lot of things that people use as supplements. I was just like, I mean, a couple of lines kind of takes care of it. If you don't have a deficiency in something, then you don't need to supplement it. I mean, that's
Right.
just kind of the bottom line for it. It's interesting you bring up though that people have that really positive reaction to B12 because they did a psychedelics trial that I describe in the book. It's an N of 1 trial where people were their own controls, and they were already dosing on psychedelics, right? Just as something that they just kind of did.
Oh,
And
okay. Yeah.
they took like their own dose of psychedelics, but the researchers subbed in nothing, for some of the doses or all of them, and nobody knew which was which. And so they had these little coded envelopes, and they would open them and scan the code, and they take a little pill, and they did this for a few weeks. And in the end, a lot of people who had straight placebo the whole time, there was nothing, and thought that they were keeping a little diary, and they thought that they were feeling the effects of their psychedelics, and they never took one. And so one of them was like, man, you put spirituality in an empty pill here. Wow. Because they had actually elicited this response from, it was an empty capsule. So,
oh,
yeah.
I'm kind of weirdly not surprised. And of
Placebo
course,
is real.
yeah, and I think the important thing to remember is that placebo is not real in the sense that there is spirituality in an empty pill.
Of course not. Yeah.
But it's real in the sense that there are non-specific effects. There are expectation effects. There are the effects of being in the clinical trial, of sitting and seeing the physician, of hoping that you're contributing to medicine, and also wanting to have a good time, or whatever the case may be. I'm remembering an old episode of Freaks and Geeks. Do you remember? I don't know if you ever watched that show,
Yeah,
but they had
I
that,
did.
and there's so many shows that have done this, but where the younger kids like got a hold of a bunch of, what was it, like non-alcoholic beer, and of course got like so drunk off of it, and it's like we've all kind of seen this example. And those of us who have done drugs when we were in school, like recreationally, like definitely there are times you never knew what you were going to get. You were buying them sort of not on the up and up, and there are definitely times when you were like, I don't feel this, or wow, I'm so messed up from this. And God, it just makes you wonder if you never were testing any of these things, because that didn't really exist when I was young. Like, how do we know if the active ingredient was there, or if it was something different, or if there was literally nothing, or what the dosage was? Like, oh my God.
Yeah, nobody knew, right? There's,
No.
they're having that problem right now with fentanyl in a really sort of horrific way. But yeah, the good old days, I think, we didn't really have so much of that.
No, like, and it just goes to show how powerful this organ, right? That's the whole point. The tailored brain, how powerful this organ is at expectation effects, at willing certain things, but also how susceptible it is to certain chemicals. And of course, you don't just cover biochemical changes from diet to drugs, but you cover behavioral change a lot in this book. And so maybe we could kind of, I don't want to fast forward all the way to the end, although I feel like the lead is sort of the sort of outcome is in the lead. But companionship, mindfulness, psychosocial support, like these things are almost as powerful in contributing to positive outcomes than the actual active ingredient.
They are so powerful. And I everybody's like, oh, you have to get this much physical activity a week. This is what you need to do, almost to the point that you feel like it's imposed on you. And so I had mixed feelings about finding how well it works, how effective it is, because I was like, oh, I have to actually say in this book that yes, physical activity is one of the only things that really shows this kind of level of effect for people. But it does. But I can say that, the good news is you don't have to go out and run. That's not what they mean by physical activity in a lot of these trials. People are just kind of moving around, like you're gardening or you're on a walk with a friend and that kind of thing. And it really is helpful. I interviewed, I think is Daniel Lieberman, who wrote this book about physical activity and the physiological things that are happening when you engage in it. And he and some co-authors proposed a pretty good sounding anyway, mechanistic pathway for how this might work. And it's kind of when you use your body like this, you produce inflammatory molecules because your body's like, whoa, what? And it starts making these, oxidating molecules. And then when it does that, it has to produce the counter effect, which is the antioxidants. And so it gets in this habit of kind of almost knowing, quote unquote, how to do that. I'll look at all these oxidating molecules. I'm going to make some antioxidants. Your body does this. And it kind of is a habit that's not a heavy lift for your body if you make it a habit. So if you're habitually going out and setting the stage for this recovery, your body is pretty good at recovery.
Oh, interesting. It's like a self-vaccine against oxidative stress.
Right? Isn't that interesting? And they've taken some of the molecules produced after exercise and used it in a physical activity and, done in some animal models and shown some dampening of this inflammatory response using molecules from a response to physical activity. Really interesting stuff. And then in the brain, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, you probably are familiar with that.
BDNF.
There you go. Yeah. And it freshens synaptic connections, and it is a refreshing kind of molecule for the brain, and physical activity bumps levels of that as well, and a lot of other stuff. So, it's not just wagging your finger at somebody and going, go, you need to go for a walk. It's, these are really things that they've measured that are happening so that you have an evidence base, you have some facts to hand that you can use when you think, I don't really feel like getting up to do this. I'm hoping maybe some of that information will be motivating.
I see the frustration. I mean, I personally feel it when I'm struggling with more like depressive episodes. I see it in patients when they're struggling with anhedonia and sort of immotivation. This almost pressure, the societal pressure that makes us feel a little bit like, well, the reason we feel sick or the reason we feel depressed is because we're not doing enough. We're not sleeping well enough. We're not eating well enough. We're not exercising enough. We're not being social enough. And like you said, this kind of imposed difficulty. And so it's about finding a balance, because the truth is you want to be well enough to engage in those things to then continue on your wellness. And sometimes that balance gets thrown off, and it's okay that there are days when you literally can't do anything. And it's okay that there are times when, the depression sort of, I don't know, prevents you from engaging. But it's kind of about getting back on the wagon whenever you can.
It is in a way. And I think that's partly where the tailoring comes. I think that if you can release the pressure, and there's nowhere in here that, I'm prescriptive about it and say, whoa, you really need to get out every single day or else. And I think it's really important to release the pressure and let yourself go on a day where you just don't feel like you can do it, and just say, that's okay. Like, you don't have to get up every single day and go do the thing. Like, it's okay to skip a day, or however many days you need to skip, because you are experiencing a nadir for example, and mood. And you just need to take the time to recover from that without imposing some other pressure on yourself.
And of course, the pandemic for a lot of us kind of screwed up some of these basics. It screwed up our routine, our sleep hygiene, our for some people it screwed up their diet, for a lot of people it screwed up their exercise regimen, and probably more than anything, it completely threw our social kind of norms out of balance. So the amount of social support, the amount of positive social interaction that we had really changed in a dramatic way overnight, and we saw negative outcomes from that. And so talk to me a little bit about kind of just companionship, social support, just the necessity of being around other people.
There's so much the way that this, I mean, I didn't anticipate when I first got, the contractor to do this book. I didn't, of course, anticipate there would be a pandemic occurring in the middle
Right.
of it. And there are so
What?
many
You didn't guess
ways.
that? How could
I
you
know.
not
How could
guess
I not have foreseen
that?
that? There's so many ways that those intersect, because if you think of people who were in assisted living and couldn't access their loved ones because of the pandemic, well, there, are studies that show, especially when you're older, that keeping those social connections is really important for cognition and kind of maintaining it and keeping engaged in things. And so the isolation that resulted from that was just a horrific effect of, what everybody felt they needed to do to try to keep people safe during especially the early parts of that. And, there have been other effects that people have talked about. Certainly, I think adolescents were heavily affected if they couldn't do what is very natural for that age, which is to engage with peers and learn from each other and, test each other and do all these things. And they couldn't do that because this virus was just running rampant. And if you know, just let everything cut loose, then the flip side of that was then they could be somebody who brought it home to a vulnerable loved one. And there's just so much that was being imposed here in terms of constraints. And so that was a big deal. It was a very big deal. And I think you see that in the way people started to try to do individual things that had a social aspect to them, like the baking that everybody was doing, right? They would get the sourdough starter and then they would share their bread pictures and everybody would talk about bread. And I noticed a lot of knitting that was going on, and people were doing knitting groups and having a lot of engagement around what looked like solo activities, but were actually social ones in the end. And so people did find some ways around it, but some people didn't have resources to do that. And I think that was devastating because it is important and it does support cognition to be social.
I mean, there's a reason that when I do a sort of my first consult with a new patient, a clinical interview, I really assess their social net. Who do you have, who's supportive? What is your family dynamic? How many friends? Not like, count friends for me, but like I want to paint a picture of what their social engagement looks like. Because although, as the whole purpose in some way of this book kind of goes to show, there's so much variability, and there are people like, I mean, I think I'm one of these people who just like really enjoys being alone. And so even though I have a lot of friends and great family, like I choose very often to have firm boundaries and to do things solo. But for those who that's not a choice, the choice was either made for them, or who do struggle with loneliness, um it is so predictive of their outcomes. Like it is a massive, it's sort of like, okay, do they have stable housing? Do they have access to healthy food? Do they have a strong social support? And are they capable of getting their medications and, and visiting the physician and maintaining their health care? Like if you say no to any of these things, and there are others, of course, I know that this person is more vulnerable to their mental illness. I know that it's going to be a harder go in therapy because they don't have all of that additional support that they need.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's kind of rhyme. In fact, I told my sister, I was talking to her about the book, and I said, well, one of the things is that social interaction is really important. And she was like, well, first of all, that's weird coming from you, because I'm also like to spend a lot of time alone. And second of all, she's like, gross, do I have to go interact with people now? Because
Right.
we're related. And I said, no, that's the tailoring part, right? Is that everybody has their level for this stuff. And I think the important thing is that you have what meets your need for that. And, I have very, very close circle of trusted beloveds and no toxic relationships with any of them. And I think it's important that to me that I have that, but it's not like a crowd of 20 or anything, And I think I quoted this in a piece I wrote for Slate, but Mary Oliver has a poem when she writes about going out into nature. And she basically kind of says, well, if you're with me out here, I must love you a lot, because generally I just like to be alone when I'm doing this.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, it's like it's so individualized and it's so personal, and yet we are so easily duped by prescriptive one size fits all marketing. And that's like, what is it about us as human beings that we want an expert, even if it's like an Instagram expert, to say to us, yeah, like, follow these 3 quick and easy things and you'll never be sad again.
It's interesting you ask. I've been listening to this Wondery podcast about cults and about personality, like cults of personality and personalities, and what draws people in, and what wellness does. And one of the people they interviewed in this podcast is a psychologist, I think. And he said, he actually and he's not a charlatan or anything. And I thought what he said kind of it made me rethink sort of my kind of attitude about wellness, because he said when he was in high school, he's 16 or whatever, he doesn't have parents maybe who were super open to listening to what his issues were, and he was struggling a lot. And so he started looking around for what he could do for himself, because he didn't have resources otherwise. And that made him kind of a fan of self-help, as long as it was actually helpful and not just a bunch of BS. And I thought, that is true. That is what people are doing. People, they can't, how hard it is to get mental health like support in this country, for example.
I'm a huge fan of self-help when it's helpful. When it's not pseudoscience. Exactly. Like, one of my big things, I have a supervisor, and her favorite thing to say is, my goal is to help you become your own therapist. Like, when she sees patients, like, I'm not going to be able to be with you forever. We're going to have a certain number of sessions we can do. And so the goal is to help you determine and develop the tools that you need to be able to continue this journey your whole life. And so very often I will identify manuals and different resources for my patients, and we won't do them together in therapy, because I want them to have it for when we're finished. I want them to be able to then engage in this manualized treatment or this journaling kind of situation that's like a multi-part thing, because I want there to be some structure even after our time is done. Because I do think there are a lot of really great resources available that people can help themselves with.
Right. And I think maybe, right. But then the person has to be able to sort it. And that's kind of what this podcast was about. It was like, how do you sort out like the qualifications of somebody if you yourself are not qualified, and if you yourself are not bringing to it, some kind of background knowledge of what qualifications look like. And so I think it would be, I don't know, maybe we need to distinguish between what actually produces self-efficacy and what is just, quote, in this self-help realm that maybe isn't that helpful, because some things really do support self-efficacy if they're tools that people can take and use, like you just described, without having to go and take time and resources for professional support, which is costly in all kinds of ways for people and really inaccessible for a lot of people. So I think that, one of the things I wanted to do with this book is maybe let people just have a look at evidence-based tools for self-efficacy and be able to maybe think about them. And I wanted also to give them a framework for thinking about them, like these sort of, networks in the brain, these hypothesized networks, and how they might operate together. And what if you think about them and try to do things that you think might affect them, I think that's actually a useful framework for gaining some self-efficacy and applying some of these tools for yourself.
I'm curious what your take, because we've talked a little bit about placebo and sort of the nature of placebo. We've talked a little bit about self-efficacy and being able to utilize these tools on your own. I've gotten in, I don't want to say arguments, but I take a pretty skeptical approach, but also one that has lately been informed more by like phenomenology and philosophy. And so I'm not like this staunch logical positivist that I used to be. And I got into a kind of an argument with a good friend of mine out here. She was talking about, something really working, and it was like straight up bullshit. And I had to, like, usually I'm like, ugh, kind of bite my tongue, but I had to be like, no, 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 that's legit debunked. Like, not only do we know that that doesn't work, it can be harmful and blah, 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 blah. And she was like, well, okay, but say it's not harmful and the person who's taking it thinks it works. Like, the placebo effect is there and they think it works. Like, isn't that a good thing? And I'm like, no, I don't think it's a good thing. I think doing things that we know have a good evidence base or maybe are up in the air is a good thing, but doing things that we know don't work, even if the person thinks they work, it's not healthy. And she's like, but why? And I was like, because you're lying to yourself. Like, and it was really hard for me to have this conversation because I felt like we were missing the mark with each other. And so I don't know. I'm curious what your take is on like the argument that engaging in a pure placebo is still beneficial.
Well, there's so many ways to respond to this. So I actually, and this is not any slag on your discussion with your friend. It's not about that. But if somebody tells me that they're doing something and they think that it works, and I kind of know that maybe there's some evidence that says no, this is nonsense, but it's not something that's like going to give them cancer that we know of. I kind of usually don't say anything and there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I don't want to harsh their vibe. Maybe, I don't want to be that one who's always like, but da, 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 the one in the contrarian in the room about supplements or whatever. But also I'm not them. And I think we know that when you look at things in trials or you're just looking at observational studies, that's a population level finding and that individuals are individuals. And so where we say this doesn't do anything, I don't want to be super hippy dippy about it, but we are individual in our responses to things. And there may be something physiologically relevant happening that's not just placebo for the person. So there's that potential. But the other side of it is that I think placebo, there's physiology underlying it, right? There are things that are happening that are underlying it that make the person feel better. And it's just a calculus that you have to do whether or not you open your mouth or not. And I think for me, the calculus is, well, do I know this actually causes harm? Because if it did, obviously I would say something. But if I don't know that and it doesn't, there's not an awareness of it on my radar, I may not say anything because there is something still happening. They're not just, your brain doesn't just go, I'm hallucinating a feeling. There's a feeling there and there's something that's producing that feeling, right? And that is real, even if the trigger for it isn't what they think it is.
Yeah, I think I might be more more down the line than you are. I think we generally agree on this. It's very different, right? When you're talking to the person than when we were talking about another person, which is a slightly different approach. Because I have to be very careful with this particular friend, because otherwise I would just constantly be arguing with her. So there is that. But I do sometimes worry about like pure pseudoscience, things that not just that are sort of up in the air, but that are like wildly debunked. I think that even if they are somewhat innocuous in terms of there's no physiological harm that can be measured from taking them, there is a harm in a cultural movement that happens where somebody chooses the pseudoscience instead of the evidence-based path.
No,
Like
that's
when you see,
certainly, yeah.
you know, like, oh,
Yeah,
I'll do
sure.
this because it's cheap, easy, or I like the story or the narrative behind it, as opposed to going to my doctor because I'm distrustful of healthcare and I'm distrustful of medicine and I'm distrustful of X, Y, and Z. And that becomes this like entrenched cultural problem that worries me when
Well, yeah,
people,
that's definitely a problem. And I
yeah.
think, I mean, like we were just talking about, people turn away from these things or can't access it. And then they find themselves turning toward, things that can be questionable.
Right, the
And
placeholder where it's sort of like
exactly.
the same motivation. It's okay, maybe it's not a licensed physician, but now it's a whole industry of unlicensed individuals who are making money off of this, who are
Right.
duping
And,
you.
right. And so the money thing and the duping thing are problems. And so if I
Right, that is
felt that,
harm.
right, right. And that is harm. And so again, it's just this very individual calculus. And you have to think, well, I mean, you just really, if it's just an individual you're speaking with, it's a case by case situation. On a broader scale, there are so many social factors that need to be addressed that aren't, before anybody actually, I think, starts going after the people who are seeking this, which you're not doing. I'm not saying you're doing that, but there's a lot of mockery out there of people who are turning to some of these things that we know don't do squat. And they're not the ones who are the problem here.
Completely agree.
Right?
It's like blaming the victims.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
No, completely agree. It's a complex problem because you're right, the system itself prevents access. And so people are forced into by the very system into these kind of dark corners where there is harm, and then they're doubly punished for engaging in the harm. Like, well, why don't you just go mainstream? It's like, because you make it impossible for me to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a reason that there are lots of people who identify as women who turn to wellness, and it's because what we encounter, maybe in the medical establishment, has not been especially efficacious for us for lots of different reasons. So, and the
Oh
other
yeah,
thing
like
is that,
maybe not including
yeah,
us in clinical trials, that would have been
yeah,
helpful.
stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is that people get pulled into some of the wellness things because those folks tell good stories, and I think I mentioned this in the book. We really like stories, and stories are useful for us in a lot of ways because we take perspective taking. We get into other people's heads and we take their perspective, and we empathize with them. And I think that the wellness gurus are absolute charlatans. Read people really well and know that is going to work on them and leverage stories in that way, which is kind of the downside to storytelling susceptibility.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the same thing when it comes to things like social psychology and marketing. It can be used for good, and like persuasion science. It can be used for good. It can be used for improving public health outcomes, for improving, the number of people showing up to the polls, and it can be used in a very dark way for selling you shit you don't need.
Yeah, yeah. Telling you have a problem and selling you the solution, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and of course, there's like I recently had on the show the author of The Shame Machine talking about the shame
Mm.
industrial complex and all the things that come along with that. But I'm curious, obviously there's so much here, and there's so much that you even had to say I'm gonna have to narrow in because there's so many components to this that I can't write a 10-part encyclopedia. So I'm curious when all was said and done and you started thinking more of a gestalt, kind of a holistic way about the tailored brain, what are you hoping that readers take away from it? Like, what are you sort of seeing as the central message of the book?
A couple of things, actually. One is that I think most people, when they want to do things for their brain, they want to be smarter. They're kind of seeking sort of global cognitive improvement in some way, and obviously a lot of people want to reduce anxiety and help their mood and things like that. But one of the things we almost never talk about is the empathy factor, and how do we improve that so that we understand each other better. And I actually interviewed a researcher at MIT last week, or no, not last week, last month. What is time? And
I
I was
know.
asking him, what he sees as sort of like way out, far out future, like a century away or something like that. And he said, that he thinks that we'll be able to implant memories, which is terrifying, first of all. But
Oh
then
my
I do write a little bit
God.
about that in the last chapter of the book. But the other thing is he thought that this would maybe like lead to world peace or something, because if you could do that, then people really could genuinely feel what the other person feels and have this perspective taking and empathy, and then everybody would understand everybody and things would be great, which I mean, that would be lovely, but the that's a minefield, this idea of implanting memory. So one of
Oh
the
my
things
God, I
is
know.
that the emphasis on empathy, I spend a whole chapter on social cognition and just how do you put yourself in somebody else's shoes, and why don't we talk about that more and emphasize that more? And then the takeaways are physical activity, right? Social interaction is not toxic for you to the level that you need. And then this was the surprising one to me, is this mindfulness practices, just getting yourself like, if you start, for me, you start to spiral in anxiety because of the pandemic and, formerly the Trump administration and things like that, stop and look around, take in your surroundings, remind yourself you're right here alive and breathing, look at little objects in your room, try not to be judgmental about it and just be in that moment. And it helps to reset that a little bit. So those are the three things.
I love that. And I couldn't agree more. I think that these are such important takeaways that take a lot of people a lot of meandering paths to get to, and you have to keep getting back to them. It's not like a once I'm there, I'm good. I often use like a thermostat analogy with inpatient care, that it's, you have these parameters, and when things fall outside of the parameters, that's when the AC or the heater kicks on to try and get back within this range. But it's always got to be a range. You're never going to get down to the degree. And B, it's a constant, battle against entropy. So we're always wanting to kind of come back and come back and come back and come back. We can't be constantly in a meditative, mindful place. It would be overwhelming.
No, you could overdo that. That's the other thing. It's always possible to overdo anything, physical activity, right? Being social. I think you can overdo that personally.
For sure you can.
Yeah. And, also mindfulness. There's always possible to overdo things. But the good thing about all of those is that they're accessible. You can access them without spending a dime. And that's kind of
Absolutely.
nice.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can learn on your own how to continue kind of along that path. And I think you could say something similar about empathy. I'm so glad that this is an area where you spend a lot of time. It's an area where I personally find myself being gravitated towards more and more. And one of the big sort of takeaways for me is that empathy is not a like uh talent. It's a skill.
No.
You have to
Yeah.
develop it. You're not
Yes,
born
exactly.
with it. You have to practice it. And I think when we start to reframe it in that way, it takes some of the negative self-talk away from it. Like, okay, maybe I'm not great at this yet, but probably because nobody ever taught me how to do it, and now I need to teach myself, and that's okay.
Right. It's not inborn. We're born with some tools to build it if people will help us build it. But we do need, you're right, people have to model it for us, teach it to us. You can intellectualize it and learn it. I'm glad you made that point because it's so true. It is a skill. It's not just like, you're not like, Deanna Troy on Star Trek and you're just born an empath necessarily, right?
But people love to talk as if they are.
I know.
As if, yeah, and that's. I think it induces a lot of self-shame in people who struggle, and it makes people move away from it, and it also it kind of reinforces that fixed mindset instead of that growth mindset, right? Yeah. That idea that like, oh, I just am who I am, so I guess I'm always going to be an asshole. It's like, no, we can work on this.
Born an asshole, gonna die an asshole. Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, well, gosh, Emily, there's so much good stuff in here, and we barely scratched the surface, but of course that's the point, because I want you guys to go out and grab the book. So you know what? I always ask my guests the same two closing questions. I had you on the show, I say somewhat recently, but again, what is time? It's probably been a couple of years now, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So maybe your answers to the last two questions have changed. So why not? Let's take another stab at it. And it's totally fine. You probably don't even remember. So it's totally fine if you repeat what you said last time accidentally. It's totally fine if your head's in a different place. But here we go. When we think about the future, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night, that you're most concerned about? Maybe you're finding some like pessimism or even cynicism, where you like legit worried. And then on the flip side of that, where are you finding hope? Where are you finding optimism? What are you kind of authentically looking forward to?
So I'm just going to keep this one close at home. I mean, the global problems we're all experiencing are obvious. And so I would just say here in this country, my concern kind of comes down to empathy and the fact that the erosion of it and the de-emphasis on it, and the fact that if we continue to do that, this abyss in the country that's splitting up factions is going to only become more uncrossable with time. So that's kind of the long-term outlook of that is definitely something that keeps me up at night, the fate of the republic and all that. And then the hope thing is there are a couple of things. I look around and purposely do this. I look at people I know who are the helpers and remind myself that they're there and that they are doing this good work. Every time you see something where, like a human right has been set back, access to that right has been, blocked, and you look at the people who are working so hard to undo the block or to keep it from happening. So I remind myself that we're here, we're doing work, right? I'm going to include myself in that because I think the people who are, we're doing work that can be done. And the other thing is I just look at things outside, look at nature and try to feel a sense of awe as much as I can so that I reset where I am in the scheme of things and try to limit anxiety by kind of limiting what sometimes your internal self can tell you is a bigger role than it is.
Absolutely. That right there, it's a massive component of that very mindfulness that you write about. And you're absolutely right. I mean, thank you so much for contributing to this important conversation, and for being a voice to help kind of bring this, not just rationality, not just cold, calculated cognitive rationality, but this emotional rationality as well to the conversation. So everybody, the book is The Tailored Brain: From Ketamine to Keto to Companionship, A User's Guide to Feeling Better and Thinking Smarter, by Emily Willingham. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure again.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.